Okay, so now that I have my photo with my objects, I'm going to start to sketch out what it will look like on paper. So since I have the table in mind, it'll make it a little bit easier to sort of map things out and understand where they're at. So I'm going to start with maybe that horizon line that divides the wall and the table. So I have sort of the line drawn out where the table is. It's kind of just roughly sketched out. Remember, we want to make sure that all of our pencil lines are done nice and light, so we can go ahead and erase. And we can make those darker as we feel more confident about the shapes and the lines that we're making. But now I'm going to go ahead and start adding objects in, thinking about the size and the shapes of each object. It can become really easy to get overwhelmed when we look at a whole image and think that we have to draw each object perfect. But I think if we break it down and look at the shapes that we see, it might make it a little bit easier. So it might help if you start in one direction, so background to foreground, or foreground to background if you want. That might make it a little bit harder if your lines start to overlap and you're not able to really manage those sizes anymore. So it might make it easiest if you do background to foreground. So in my case, I would be starting with the mug and moving from the chapstick to the hair clip to the earrings. There's a lot of ways you can start this process. My go-to is sort of just lightly sketching and feeling everything out as I move along. So if we look at my image, that chapstick kind of comes up and cuts that the bottom of that mug off. But I'm gonna go ahead and draw that line anyway. And I can always erase, right? So that's sort of the great thing about using pencil is that we can always go back and erase. I'm just doing light sketching right now, not doing anything, no shading or details, just making sure that we're getting those shapes in that we need. And we can break this down into shapes, right? Thinking about the shapes that we see. And so if we think about the mug, maybe as a sort of cylinder, and having that rounded bottom as it goes back into space. And as I start to draw the handle for my mug, one great thing about drawing from observation is you can always really pay attention to the sort of space markers that you have. So if I look at the photo, I know that the bottom of the handle goes slightly above where my table's at. And so I can kind of use that as a guide to know when to start to draw the base of my handle. And the whole time I'm drawing this, I keep looking at my reference photo, right? So I didn't just take the photo and look at it every now and then. I am constantly going back and looking at the lines that I'm making and paying attention to those details and going nice and slow. One nice thing that might help you out is when you start to break down your objects and look at the shapes that they're making. If we look at the handle, it's sort of just like a big C or a big ear, right? Following that curve. So that's another way you can look at it, is really, again, just trying to break down to see the shapes. We're not going to get into really the highlights and the shadows that we see, but if you want, you could always maybe sort of mark them out on your paper, just because on those some of those objects, like the earrings, the hair clip, and the mug, there's these really bright highlights that are happening from the light reflecting off of it. So now that I have my mug sort of sketched out, we're going to look at the object that's next in my image. So the next one that sort of comes is that chapstick that's on its side. And if you have something sort of like my chapstick that's super detailed with a lot of text, think of ways that you can simplify it. I think viewer of your artwork can sort of understand what the object is without having all of those tiny texts and things. And I think a lot of the times by trying to include that, it may really do a disservice to your artwork rather than make it stronger. So think about if you need to include all of those details or not. Okay, so as we move forward, if you start drawing and your objects this looks sort of off to you, but you can't really figure out why, that might have something to do with your perspective and the lines that are being made. So, right, this chapstick is going back into space, but it's sort of at an angle, right? And so one way that you can check your lines if they start to look a little weird is see if they are parallel. So what I mean by that is if you kept drawing your lines to see if they would ever touch. So I started out with my chapstick and the lines started to look a little weird, and I took a ruler and I extended those lines out a little bit further to see if they would ever cross. So if your lines, when you start to draw them and then all of a sudden you see that your lines would be coming to a point, instead see what kind of adjustments you can make to make sure that your lines continue to be parallel so that they can continue on a running track and make sure that they would never touch. So now that I have sort of where that chapstick is sketched out, we're going to look at the next object that comes after that. So that hair clip. This object's a little bit trickier, and so we'll have to really pay attention to those lines. And for me, it's going to be easiest if I sort of break it down like section by section. So looking at where that first set of clips is, and I know it extends all the way to the end of my page, so I can give myself sort of a size reference and how much space I need to leave each one of those sort of claw things. And two, don't feel discouraged if you start to do this and you're not really loving your sketch. Remember, this is just a sketch. Things really come into fruition and view whenever you start to really add those shades and highlights and shadows and all of that. So this is right now, remember, this is just a basic sketch. Okay, so this is what I have so far. I'm not in love with the earrings. I'm going to mess around with that a little bit more. But this is sort of just a rough sketch of the photograph I took. When you have something, if it's super tiny and detailed, sort of like on my earrings, the clip part, not clip, like the part that goes in your ear, if you're struggling to get those small details and you like zoom in on your photograph that you took for your still life and you're still sort of really struggling to get those details, don't worry about it too much. It'll probably get lost when we start to shade things in anyway, so just kind of rough it out and don't try to spend a whole lot of time on it and make yourself frustrated. Again, I think the biggest key is when looking to see sort of your cues of how things are aligned. So, for example, on the hair clip, in the photograph, all three of the bottom sort of prongs were kind of lined up. So for each one I started to draw, I could sort of line it up with the first one to make sure that it was still making sense throughout my photograph, throughout my drawing. So, yeah, that's sort of how we start to get things sketched out.